So, very high level, something like, I passionately believe technological process or innovation does not happen on its own, right? Like things just don't organize themselves to advance technology. It's actually, I think the opposite, right? If you look at, the world we live in, everything, that we interact with, and we've been talking about property management a lot. I see so many things. I know, the entrepreneurs who've built these companies, like I know they've been beaten up for years. They spend 2 or 3 years building something, spend another 2 or 3 years trying to convince people to use it to maybe get it to work, right? And so, but then, everybody gets to benefit from that.
Welcome to the episode of the Profitable Property Management Podcast. Today, I am introducing somebody to the world of property management that nobody has ever heard of or met before. Everybody, meet Thad Tarkington. Thad, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hello, excited to be here. So quite the introduction. Let's see. So my name is Thad Tarkington. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Second Nature, and so from Raleigh, North Carolina. Been in this industry now a decade, which is crazy to say. We're actually here at the NARPM National Conference.
That is crazy to say.
If you notice the beautiful background here in the hotel setup. But we're I was talking with a bunch of folks about that. How, what do you think this is going to look like in 2034 or 2033? And we were, it was an interesting thought. So, but yeah, been in the industry 10 years. Second Nature provides call a resident experience platform for property managers. So we organize a bunch of resident-facing solutions into one platform and make it easy for property managers to offer unique resident experience, deploy services, things like that. So,
Veteran, been around the block. I'm obviously being sarcastic. We've talked before. We've palled around, and man, 10 years. That's a long time. I've been doing Lead Simple for about 10 years, and things are a lot different today than they were from day one. Mostly in a good way. I feel like the industry has progressed tremendously. It's been a lot of positive trends. I like seeing other vendors come in. I feel like as the ecosystem improves as a whole, as business practices get better, it's just like a net positive.
Yeah.
As you reflect back, what in your mind's eye stands out as like what the feel or the vibe or the ethos is most different from day one for you?
Yeah, I'd say one thing that I think has changed a lot is there does seem to be a level of kind of professionalization that's gone throughout the industry. Simple things I can think of is like, I look at stuff that's like, it almost seems obvious, like this should have always existed. Mm-hmm. And one of those is like accounting standards. Mm-hmm. It's like, and it's crazy to think, like, if you look back, 10 plus years ago, something like that was really just starting to get shuffled out, wasn't really standardized. And for an industry, as big as rental housing, it's, and if you look at, what a lot of people manage, in this industry or in this organization, specifically here, single family rentals, kind of mom and pop, small multifamily, kind of duplex, quadplex, that kind of property. It's the largest number of units out there. Obviously, a lot of self-managing, so it's highly fragmented. But it's interesting that you're seeing stuff like that, just come around in the last, decade or so. And then, you mentioned the vendor hall. Like thinking about walking through there. Again, there's so many things you look at, and you're like, they might have come on the scene in the last couple of years. Just getting started. And you're like, and it seems like it should have been here for 30 years, right? Mm-hmm. So I think you're starting to see a lot of good solutions come into the space. And then I think if you also look at the institutional side of the industry, you've seen obviously in 2000, let's go back 10 years, 13, they were still in that acquisition phase, and obviously the price of the properties were attractive enough. People said, let's give this a try. No one before thought you could manage units at scale. To where you can deploy serious capital, and obviously at that point, at this point that's been proven. So I think when I look back, like, kind of all those different forces, you have the kind of institutional, that's brought more interest, I think, brought more awareness to the space. And some of that's kind of, flowed over to, I think the kind of third party management side. But yeah, I mean, that would be a collection of things. What's your take on that?
What's my take about what's different? Yeah, it's more professional. I mean, there's more money here.
Yeah.
People see the opportunity and the money is pouring in. And again, I feel like it's a net positive.
Yeah.
I have more money men contacting me and wanting to meet up for lunch and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And that to me is a sign that capital sees value here. And when capital is deployed, things get more efficient, more opportunities come, greater services, better SLAs. So all that stuff is a net positive. And honestly, I don't see too many downsides. I see the individual operators getting stronger, building more durable, defensible businesses. And interestingly, I don't want to be too self-aggrandizing, but I do think that you and I both have contributed to that in part. The revenue conversation has been shifted in large part by awareness in the room of just thinking about revenue, not doors, but how can I make this a business that is going to provide me recurring revenue that I can keep? How is a robust enough revenue model that there's meat on the bone for operators to actually take home? That's really the magic of small business. You guys have backed into it from the resident benefits package. Yeah. I remember early on, it was a tenant benefits package, and it was informal, and it was just kind of scattershot. It's turned into something that's packaged, is well understood. There's a million affordances to help you communicate that to your tenants and owners. That's made a huge difference. The work that we're able to do with NARPM accounting standards, the framing of the money conversation, the unit economics, that's elevated the IQ, and that generated a lot of interest. And that wave has processed to the point now where it's not novel. Not everybody is doing it, but there's not a whole lot that's novel about it. So now that we're at this point of that cycle and wave, I think like what's interesting to me and what I want to talk to you about is what comes next. One of the things that I hear whispers about is regulation. What's the regulatory environment going to look like? The rental market is softening right now. The economy is not in the best place. We're coming off of the hottest market within my lifetime that I can recall. Yeah. And so now people are looking at some of these fees and wondering, is this sustainable? Obviously, there's leaders in California and New York, like the outlier states that are kind of a bellwether of what could happen elsewhere. So I just want to let's start there, man. Let's just talk durability. Yeah. Which of these sources of revenue will we be able to keep? Which might potentially be at risk? This is a strong adjacency with what you guys are doing. How do you think about that? Walk me through your thoughts there.
Yeah. So take a step back and maybe start with, you mentioned regulation, and I'll save the conversation of is regulation good or bad.
Separate conversation.
Yeah. So but I will say it's highly probable, right? So good or bad, who knows? Mm-hmm. That's there's a long debate there, and I think it varies. But is it is it probable? And I think the answer is yes. And if you look, it's an industry where it's people's housing. It's, you've got tens of millions of properties, about 100 million people in the U.S. live in rental housing. And so, there's obviously already a lot of regulation. I think you'll continue to see more of it. And so I think the key thing that, we look at when we look at the industry is there's really 3 points. It's, how do you have, one, transparency, and then how do you have accountability, and how do you have choice? So if you're thinking about offering something to a resident, how do you hit those 3, right? And so, ultimately, if you look at, the White House has put some things out around regulation. If I read through that, there's a lot of things where I'm like, okay, they need to do a little more research. It's not perfectly dialed in, but there's some reasonable stuff in there, right? Like, if you put yourself in the shoes of, a renter or an investor, right? They're always going to have, some different interests. But ultimately, I think at the end of the day, if there's a clear definition of, as the investor and owner of a property, this is your responsibility. As a renter, this is your responsibility. And that's clearly laid out. Ultimately, I see it as, where property management can shine is, hey, we've come up with some really elegant solutions to solve these problems for both parties. Those are presented transparently to both parties on how they want to solve them. And so, simple examples there would be, if I look at, lawn service, I think it's just easy for anyone to understand listening is, if you're renting a home you have to mow the lawn. And for a lot of people that are moving from an apartment, or some, have never been responsible, they may not even be thinking about it, right? They move in day one, they're like, oh gosh, like grass is getting big. What do I do? Well, you got to spend a couple $100 on a lawnmower. You got to do these different things, right? And, it takes time and effort. And there's a downside, though. If someone doesn't mow the lawn, not only may there be HOA violations, city violations, things like that. If you don't take care of it at all, you could see your lawn die. And then that can easily be thousands, or depending on the lawn, $10,000+ to go in and get it back to shape. Also, some stuff like that, again, unless you go on the really expensive side, it can take time. And so you look at like a problem like that and say, okay, if somebody just completely ignores this and doesn't take care of it, it's one, kind of a bad experience while the resident's there. It's not great for the neighbors, the community. But then two, somebody's stuck holding the bag, and it was kind of a more expensive problem at the end. And so you say, okay, well, how do you really solve that? And I think, that's where you kind of hit those pieces of transparency, accountability, and choice. So on the transparency side, it's here's what the responsibility looks like. Here's a clear definition of what a maintained lawn looks like. And then on the choice side, it's saying, okay, here's, different ways you can solve this problem, right? You can do this yourself, right? It's in that scenario, here's what it's going to cost to actually maintain a lawn. And it's not free. You have to buy material, you have to do it. It's going to take time. So what's that look like? What's the regularity of that, And then on the other side, it's okay, hey, here's an option to have it done for you. And maybe there's, different tiers of that. Tier one is, this is going to meet the least responsibility. We're going to make sure, the grass is mowed, edges are trimmed. That's it, right? You don't get to go outside and, talk to the landscaper and say, hey, I want a rose there. Like, no conversation. It's done, right? This is like when you're in a commercial building and they just take care of the property. And then on, the higher tier, it's, hey, we've got you a boutique landscaper. They're going to come out, they're going to touch everything up, and you get to work with them if you want to do anything, right? And so, like, right there, I think if you look at that, on the one side, it's you've given transparency, choice, but you've also created accountability. And the way that you do that is through clear expectations of, hey, if you don't do this, you may be required to do this. And so, ultimately then, the property manager is protecting everyone's interests, the investor, the owner, and the resident. And in the event that somebody maybe chooses that premium option, they can get referral fees or things like that and generate revenue. So I think you see this, dynamic there where everybody's winning and there's revenue driven, where if you look at, any industry, obviously that's what you see, people are willing to pay for value, for convenience, and so it's how do you take a property manager who, has that access to customers, has a lot of important things they need to get done, and how do you get them in that value equation, able to monetize it and add value, convenience to others. So I think, I could give dozens of other examples of different areas, but that's an area where I think, that's a simple example where I think to answer your question around where does this go in the industry, and I think it's, again, whether it's good or bad, I think it's going to happen, and I think there's, easy ways to kind of work that win for everybody.
Now, what you're saying both makes sense to me as a value-add offering. It also feels like an adjacency to regulation directly on it. Are there people in the state legislature that want to make sure that you don't have the option to have a great yard? Probably not. It's more like things that are more intrinsically baked into housing. So that doesn't quite seem like what's more likely to get targeted.
Yeah.
It would be more stuff that is required and mandated. And this is one of the things I want to ask you about is I hear the POV coming from you that's very much about choice, optionality, accountability. It really just sounds like a net positive, dare I call it a triple win, if you will. And my thought here is that the thing that is more likely to get targeted is a byproduct of a desire on behalf of some small businesses that really isn't about those things. It's just revenue. I just want to get the revenue. I don't want choice. I want to mandate. I want to make this a fundamental net increase to what tenants are paying. Yeah. I know that you interact with a subset of customers that are really all in on resident experience, and a subset of customers that's really not a priority. It's just it's a revenue draw. And when I interact with that, I think two things. I think, first off, if you are a true professional property manager providing real value, where this tenant is net dramatically better off renting from you than renting directly from an owner, you've built margin into the value that you're creating. And if you choose to monetize and capture some of that via a resident benefits package that seems totally commensurate to value.
Yeah.
If you're not doing a good job, if you're a Class C property manager and the service sucks and you're adding this on and it's mandated and there's no choice in it, that's a lot more friction in that process. How do you think about the POV that you articulated kind of intersecting with the intention of the operator that's actually rolling it out?
Yeah, so there's a couple pieces to look at there. So I think if you look at so I'll talk about a business problem first, and then can talk a little bit more about, I think how it relates to the regulatory side and the property managers and how they offer these. So the business problem I see today is for a property manager, a lot of things around communication to resident and, getting your lease signed is a fairly manual process. I mean, you have a leasing agent who's, you've got self-showings now. You've got a lot of tech, again, that like 10 years ago didn't exist or wasn't at scale at all. So you've really started to see these gaps close. But one key piece right now is if, going back to the lawn example, and, I know you mentioned, hey, no one wants someone not to mow a lawn. That sounds great. And I think you're right. And the point would be, well, what if someone said, hey, as part of this property, you get this lawn service, no choice, right? Then I think you'd see some pushback.
Yeah,
right?
You have to have a world-class lawn.
So I probably jumped ahead there saying, hey, everyone just uses lawn service. 20% of residents are great, 80% aren't. I've had enough. Everybody's doing it, right? Mm-hmm. And you may see that in some certain property types. Maybe it makes sense in certain property types or certain markets. But largely speaking, I expect you get some pushback. Again, right or wrong, up to the individual. But you'll definitely have some people push back if you do that. And so I think if you look at the challenge, though, it's all right. Well, I want to make this a service. I'm adding value offering this product. For a specific property manager, if they have a leasing agent, which oftentimes this is a commission-based role, it's something that they're doing a lot of different things, trying to manage a lot of moving parts. To then expect, okay, they're also going to get trained really well across dozen different offerings and really be able to educate residents, have a conversation. And also when there's good revenue to generate, but it's not going to be material to a leasing agent, right? So you kind of look at that and say, okay, you can't really offer anything boutique through a leasing agent. So that's where you kind of get to the scenario where people go, okay, I want to offer these value-added services, either do them in buckets, different, types of properties, they kind of have to bulk dispatch them, so to speak. And I think that's one of the challenges you see with, some residents may say, hey, I'd like to do this differently. And, that's where that kind of friction comes in, is I think it's an operational issue. Now, to your point, there's definitely, folks say, hey, I'm just going to, add in all these different things, mandatory, trying to drive revenue. And then, if you look at the regulatory side, really the main thing they're looking for is transparency, right? I mean, you can offer products and services for sale anywhere, right? But, how do you make it transparent? So, is this something where, somebody comes in, they go to the listing, they look at it like, hey, this looks great, and then, they pay an application fee, some different moving expenses, and at the last mile, it's like, hey,
by the way,
yeah, like I've already made a moving commitment. I stopped looking at other properties, but by the way, you have to do this, right? And so I think that's where it's all about, offering something, upfront and transparently, if it's going to be mandatory, and then, if it's optional, really at any point, presenting that. And so, if I look back to at least, what we do in the industry, our only practice really has ever been, hey, this goes into the listing, right? In the listing, here's the value add things you get, right? And there's obviously, benefits to walking through. Here's what you get renting. There's huge impacts. If I look at, different programs, something, and again, it depends on the asset type, but if you look at, you mentioned some classy assets, one of the products we offer is a credit reporting product, right? And so that can be a material benefit. It's people's biggest expense. And usually your rent is not reported to the credit bureaus, but if it is, there's been studies that show, 40, 50 point increases in that first year of renting. And, as you know, you could actually qualify for a mortgage or certain loans. If you're getting one, even if you already qualified, you're probably saving at minimum tens of thousands of dollars, in a lot of cases over $100,000 over the life of that loan, going from, a very high interest rate down to kind of lower the market rate. And so, there's certain benefits like that where people see it and go, wow, like that's life changing. I'd like to take advantage of that. And so again, I think it's best for all parties to show, okay, hey, here's the value. It goes into the listing, and it's transparently there. There's obviously going to be your folks who may say, hey, I didn't see that, I didn't read it. That kind of stuff happens. So that's where, again, I think about offering choice in your resident experience is, does provide that best experience to residents. And, that's something we've been working hard on. A lot of these things take time, but, we've kind of built this resident experience configurator where, the resident can go in and they can see, and the way I like to describe it is a single asset, all these are typically one-on-one if they're single family, they're very spread out. So you don't get that same scale you would get, at a large multifamily property. And so if you think about, the service experience for designing, they're generally available nationally, different properties, but a resident can go in and get the economy experience, or the Four Seasons experience, right? So they can go through and see, okay, maybe I'm moving here for a year, and it's like, I want to move in, everything's set up, my utilities on, I want the lawn mowed, I don't want to buy a lawnmower, coming here for a job assignment for a year, and like, heck, I might even want, a base set of like living room and bedroom furniture set up, and I just turnkey and move in. I'm here a year or two, I get out. And again, you might have someone move in who says, hey, I want to do everything, budget conscious and things like that. But ultimately, you've kind of designed this closed loop system to say, okay, here's your responsibilities as each party. Here's what you need to pay for to maintain a property. Here's things that you can choose. But ultimately, if you don't do your responsibility, you may be required to do it this way. But that's all clearly laid out in an easy to digest, easy to read manner. So it's not, section 37 of a, 20-page lease. It's nice, easy UX, modern UX on a phone. You can just kind of click through your computer and see what that looks like. So that's really the main thing we've been working on to really, as we look at the next 10 years, how do we, expand offering a lot of, some things, there's so many things that aren't practical to maybe offer to a wide base, but there's definitely certain things, again, like on the credit side, the maintenance sides, like with air filters or pests, where it's like, hey, 100% of people need to do this. Here's a convenient way to do this. So I think you'll still see depending on the offering, certain things I think will be, provided the whole portfolio. Just, hey, this is part of renting, you get this, and other things will be optional. But this tool kind of allows both the education and the choice side. And then, the business process and the rules is where you get that accountability.
This is really interesting to me. And for those that are listening and it's not clear, you were talking about some technology innovation that you guys are offering, and it speaks to the unique aspect of offering services in residential property management. In my mind, in an Airbnb world, this would be it would just be the UX. In long-term property management, it all has to go through the lease, and so it's a much more in many cases, a lot of the friction is just like, I mean, how many times have you heard this? I'm not in your business, and I've heard this a million times. They're like, well, I was going to roll it out, but then I got to wait for the contracts to turn over and the 12 months, blah, blah, blah. And the reality is that the juice is worth the squeeze, but there is some squeeze involved. You're talking about lowering the bar to actually get this done, to roll it out. You've got my interest. We've talked about this before. One obvious thing that comes to mind is making changes intra-period. If 6 months into a lease, I change my mind, I want to turn something on that wasn't on, that kind of flexibility and dynamicism hasn't really existed. It's typically felt pretty heavy, and who wants to be modifying a lease manually halfway through a tenancy? Walk me through how dynamic you're hoping this will be.
Yeah, I mean, I think you nailed it. It's the idea is, again, here's your responsibilities, and this is something that just hasn't existed, right? You typically, once your application is approved, there's some series of communication to, make sure you want to move in, and then, your lease is usually generated, right? And as a document sign, right? And so you get that, you read through it, you ultimately sign, maybe there's a few check boxes in there. And so this actually kind of sits between there and says, okay, resident come through, configure their exact services, and then that gets passed over to the document, the lease generation. So it can be generated with all the things that they want to offer, loaded into that. And if you look at, flexibility, I would say that's kind of the core idea here is, I could live somewhere 2 years, my life changes, something happens, and, I want to add something, I want to remove part of that experience, and it's easy to hop right back in and say, okay, unilaterally, I can just make an edit here, It updates, the agreement between the customer, and we move on. Obviously, some things, again, you can't go in and change your rent, but you might be able to go in and turn on or off your lawn service. So.
Yeah, the idea of flexibility here is somewhat groundbreaking to me. In my sensibilities, being in the software game, the UX feels like the lower lift, right? There's probably a number of people could fill out the UX, but figuring out the UX in the context of working with legal contracts, that's interesting. And that, I think, is probably a paradigm that a lot of people are going to want to port into and build off of. And you've obviously brought a number of different offerings into the fold. When you think about vendors that you're going to partner with, and this is one of the things that's really interesting to me about you, is that I see you and some of your staff, I talk to people like Smallwood, et cetera. You guys are looking at so many different potential partnerships. Walk me through the mental model that you apply about what's a fit and what's not. Because I see you're applying a fair bit of discrimination, even though from the outset it may look like you guys are doing a lot. It's got to be 10 to 1 of stuff that you're passing on versus things that you're entertaining.
Yeah, so if we're looking at the way we're thinking about this, so one, you nailed it earlier, like, creating a UX, pretty straightforward. How do you do it that works with all the different markets, all the different compliance pieces? And that's really kind of one of the main values is, if you're in even multiple counties, sometimes you have some variation. So it's, kind of that compliance at scale. And the piece we look at on the service side, given you have properties that are, again, spread across the U.S. and the asset types, may vary slightly, it's really thinking through, okay, what's a solution that can add value to a large enough percent of the base? Also, if you look at a lot of products in the, in the industry, you've seen vendors come in from outside and say, hey, I sell X, and, you should buy it. And someone goes, wow, like, that's really cool. It doesn't perfectly fit, though. Could you do this differently, maybe on the invoicing side? Could you fulfill the service, with some slight tweaks? And what you see is, a provider who says, hey, I offer this solution. We can use a simple example like pest control, something we recently partnered with Pest Share and launched. Pest control vendor goes, hey, I'd love to offer pest control. Property managers go, hey, I'd love to buy it. Well, how do you buy it? You go to this web link and sign up with a credit card. And then we're going to call you and schedule. Well, if I have 300 properties, that doesn't really work well. And maybe they go, okay, you can send us a CSV and we'll upload it. But, that's the kind of, friction. Obviously for that pest control company, it's like, well, it doesn't make sense to build a whole process for a couple local property managers. But then you look at, a solution like, on-demand pest control. It says, okay, we've designed this to work for the problems set to a resident or investor, right? This is really how do you solve a problem in the most economically efficient way? If you look at, pest control, getting someone to come out quarterly and spray, is really kind of a luxury service. And again, I say luxury lightly, there's a lot of people who may disagree and go, wow, I hate bugs, right? But, it's not the most cost-effective way, right? Once you see a problem, having someone come out to solve it, that's specifically, for that industry, is a lower cost method. And for something like, the on-demand pest control, the idea is, okay, there's certain resident responsibilities, there's certain investor responsibilities. Neither people budget for it. If you don't budget for it, then you're only going to get upset. There's going to be fighting over whose responsibility. So how do you say, okay, hey, this is actually a solved problem. You have me manage your property, you rent from me. This is taken care of. You don't have to think about it. It's budgeted for. By the way, when you have an issue, just go in here, say your issue. There's, no deduction. There's no hoops to jump through. We just come out and solve the problem, right? It's a really elegant experience, and it removes that highly emotional event, right? So something that we're commonly looking at is property management is a very reactive game. You're constantly getting bombarded with problems. No one reaches out if they don't have a problem. And so if you work in this business, if you work in this industry, you talk to the people, in this space, you hear it's just a very exhausting business. You can't get a vacation. Problems happen always at the worst hour. And so, what we're looking at is, okay, what are all those unique problems? And how do we bring a tailored solution to this industry that removes those highly emotional events? So in certain cases, with like filters, it's okay. This is a problem where if you don't change it, it's actually much more expensive. How do we have a preventative solution? for pest control, it's unbudgeted for, and nobody agrees. I lived there for 4 years. I move. I hire you to rent it. 6 months later, there's cockroaches. Again, whose fault is that? Who knows? But it's not budgeted for, and that's now the PM on Friday night is playing middleman and trying to calm people down, and ultimately one person is going to leave really pissed off. The other is going to be mad that they were even considered at fault, right? So you have a lose-lose situation, and so. To get back to your question on like the mental model, I think it's one, what's a highly emotional event? How do we solve that? Two, it's how do we bring, a partner that we can work with that says, hey, we're willing to think differently or do some things differently, right? And so every partner we've worked with to date, it hasn't just been a plug and play. We have worked together and say, okay, regulatory compliance, I think about with, the pest thing, did a study with them and found, okay, there's different states that handle things differently. Bed bugs here, this market here, so there we do that work. How are we doing the billing? How are we doing, making sure this aligns with the value? And so like that's really it. So I think if you say, okay, hey, 10-1, maybe, 9 of those are really interesting solutions. They may not be at scale yet. It may not be, there may not be that willingness to really work on a tailored solution or that resource available to do that. So that's kind of the mental model. And then for us, it's, our whole thing is, with our, property managers we work with, say like, hey, work with whoever you want, right? We want to help you design a good system. And we want to bring you, when we bring something forward, we want to make sure it's, vetted, really, designed well, and we think it's going to solve your business problem. And so ultimately, I wouldn't say we're of the objective to get as many things as possible, although we hope more and more stuff comes in the industry. But as we can design a good solution, we'll bring it in. But, we have a ton of folks we work with who are doing a lot of things on the resident experience side that our team will even help them with. In many cases, we've even kind of rolled into our program and help administer that, we're not filling service or, really involved in the economic side of it, other than, helping to kind of provide that resident experience to our PM.
So the attention that you're paying to vendors is a derivative of the attention that you're paying to use cases, practical, specific problems that the tenant, the owner, the property manager is having. You're attentive. You're deep in those use cases, which I really appreciate. And so one of the things that I know is that you're also paying attention to the power dynamics between different vendors, data pieces, et cetera. I'm curious to get your take on how you see the landscape evolving, specifically with the property accounting software vendors. I see power shifting in that ecosystem. The ecosystem historically has been closed. In some cases, you could describe it as a pretty hardcore walled garden. And even now, as it's opening, in many cases, it's opening under a very specific controlled set of circumstances, as opposed to more of a free market, plug and play, let the data flow and the chips fall where they may. I see that this openness is shifting some of the power away from the property management accounting software vendors as having like a singular choke point on things. And not only are there more vendors in this space, but there's way more collaboration happening, et cetera. Are you seeing the same thing observationally? And if so, what do you think it means in terms of like the net outcome for property managers?
Yeah. So one, definitely seeing the same thing, right? I think if you look at the industry, you're definitely seeing a lot of new software players in the accounting space. They're coming online and, fully open, kind of a modern tech stack. Some of these have the advantage of, they started building in the last 5-10 years, and, so for some companies that are 30, 40 years old, right, there's definitely, some different technical things to think through. You've got a ton of legacy customers, different versions you're trying to manage. So, but I think, what you're seeing for, the modern kind of stacks is, that's kind of what they're doing. That's the world of tech today. Everything's open. Ultimately, if you look at a property manager, right, this is their data. These are their customers, right? They're investors and residents. That's their data. And so I think it's just one of those things we talked about earlier of like, what seems obvious and you're kind of surprised it didn't exist. I think 5-10 years from now, you'll look back and be like, you didn't used to have integrations in it. That was not, look at everything we're doing to run a great business. Look at how it's actually impacted the industry. Look how this is a better experience for everyone. Integrations lower costs and, they generally reduce uninteresting kind of work, right? So you think about the amount of work people do to kind of fulfill things today, and people provide plenty of offerings. But there's usually extra effort. There's errors and data discrepancies and things like that. And so ultimately, I think everyone will look around and be like, hey, this is just a better product for the entire industry. And that's kind of stuff that eventually allows you to grow the TAM and get more people involved. And so overall, I think it's something that seems obvious will happen. If I look at the impact, there's definitely some folks that industry specific products that they're going to work through all the effort to make something work with a property manager. But if you look at other industries, there's a ton of products and services or offerings out there where someone might say, hey, this would be really cool for a small percentage. And if there was clean data structure for the entire industry, I could plug into almost like I know there's different companies out there now, like Propify and some others saying, hey, we'll have one integration deploy everywhere, right? If someone could plug into that and say, okay, I'll have an engineer work on this, it's easy integration. I think about Stripe, right? When we first set up Stripe, back in the day for our consumer website, I think somebody did that in, half a day. I mean, obviously if you're doing this at scale, you might need to button up more, but it was pretty straightforward, And so I think if you get to a point where I can plug in, I need to access a certain part of a system, I want to provide this service, this is a quick project, you'll start to see a lot more innovation that people didn't even think about start to flood into the space. But most importantly, I think, what you'll see is the whole ecosystem kind of working together, getting to a standardized kind of structured data set. It's going to lower costs. It's going to provide better offer. Like that's just, what you see. And it's somewhat of a necessity to keep up. So
competition, the free market is fundamentally good for consumers. That's one of my core bedrock beliefs. And we see that playing out here. I think Rentvine, for example, is an interesting use case as a vendor. Less so the company, shout out to those guys, great people, but more archetypally, you think about Clayton Christensen, Innovator's Dilemma, when the basic premise there is that as legacy companies get bigger and bigger and bigger, eventually someone realizes that in many instances they are over-serving a subset of their consumers. The legacy vendors offering so much stuff that really customers would be happy with 30% of that product offering. And someone else comes along to offer that 30% at a lower cost with more flexibility, et cetera. And that's where new innovation kind of competes away and chips away at legacy vendors. I'm really glad to see vendors like Rentvine, there's Doorloop, there's a couple of others that aren't even coming to mind right now. It's shaking things up and it's putting pressure on large incumbents to make some needed changes that are really a net positive for the industry. So I remain optimistic and bullish around what's possible for this industry. I want to end today's interview talking a little bit about stress, working stress in the business. I'm coming off of, let's say, over the last 6 to 8 weeks, I've been feeling a lot of stress, Thad. I just tell you, man, I've been under it. I've been in it. I've been getting my ass kicked a bit. And I want to ask you about it because I want to hear how you process stress. It's inevitable. I heard somebody say that pain is inevitable, suffering is a choice. Suffering is an orientation about how you relate and what you make up to about what you're experiencing. For me, I am committed to interpreting my stress as being a function of how I'm holding the events and my relationship with it, rather than externalizing, which is to say, well, I'm upset and I feel this way because these things happen, and when these things happen, I have to feel upset. I don't like that belief system. That doesn't really serve me. It creates more stress, and I want to be in a place of low stress, not high stress. I can't do this for another 5, 10, 20 years if I'm gritting. Walk me through what sources of stress look like for you and how you stay resilient in the game instead of just, I mean, I know you haven't gripped for 10 years. It's not possible. How do you navigate that?
That's a good question. When first acknowledging, like, if you're building a business of any sort, you're going to have stress. Things are going to pop up. I think back to, there's this song, I think it was like a fake commencement speech or something called like Sunscreen. And one of the lines I like, it was like, the biggest worries in your life will hit you on an idle Tuesday afternoon that you didn't expect. It's not the things you're thinking about. It's just, something I've realized is like every day you're going to have, for me at least, in what we're doing, it's like, there's probably a dozen things that pop up that are not like, oh, this is great news, right? Hey, it's a problem we need to solve. Not always bad news, but just, hey, something's not working. We need to solve it. And something I found that's funny, we were talking about that kickball example right before we started this. whatever is the worst that day, I generally get equally stressed and bothered and upset by that. So, something that could be, objectively on a 1 to 10 scale, a 10 problem will get me nearly as upset as something that is a 3. If that day the 3 is the biggest thing. Now, I'm not saying there's not edge cases, but like I've kind of noticed, like the simplest thing, like a neighbor, says something weird to you and you're just like, it just makes you so angry. And then like you walk inside and like, some major problem happens. You're like, now I'm angry at this. And then like, it's,
Same level of volume, even though the significance of it varies.
Yeah, you're taking the trash out and the bag breaks, and you're just like, again, not everything's on the same scale, but it's kind of like there's this inherent cap of like, I'm just angry and stressed, and so, I think for myself at least, I often kind of look at stuff and I go, okay, what can I do about this, right? Like. And I've gotten much better at this over the years. But there might be an example of something that bothered me. And like 2 hours later, I'm still thinking about it. And I'm like, okay, what can I do to solve this? I don't want to feel this way. Stress is not good. There's a lot of scientific data that's not good for you. So it's like, okay, here's the action I can take. I'll mentally map out, okay, I'm going to do these things. Here's going to be the potential outcomes. It's going to take this long. And until I get to these next milestone points, like nothing's really going to change, right? So maybe there's an issue with, employer or customer, and okay, tough decisions made, send it, okay. Once we, until I hear back, I need to move on. And so, I think about this, to me, if I like put an analogy to something very simple, like going to the gym, right? If you're a runner, right, and you try and run a 4-minute mile or whatever these marathoners run for 20 plus miles, it's crazy. You can't do it, right? You're exhausted. But, if you practice for years and years, you get really good. And so to me, just like trying to run a 4-minute mile, it's the same as trying to manage stress, right? If every time something hits you that's stressful, if you say, okay, this is an exercise, how do I get better at doing this? How do I create a process to organize, compartmentalize the information and operate on it? I think every time you incrementally get better. And I found, for myself now, all those little small things that happen in life, a lot of them I can get over like this. I'm just like, okay, it's not a big deal. I'm going to move on. And then, when and that saves the energy, I think, for the more important things. So, ultimately, like, you're not going to avoid it. It's going to happen. In my experience, again, it's been like, and I'm not saying there's not days that are, pretty carefree and, things can vary, right? Every once in a while you might catch a Saturday and, for a PM, a resident doesn't put a ticket in, doesn't call in, nothing burns that, right? So, you may catch that day, but like generally speaking on a work day, you're going to interact with stuff that doesn't go your way. And, you got to just, I think, take a step back. I think the pessimistic thing would be like, oh, you're, justifying something. But in many ways, I think that can be good for people's mental health is, okay, how do I explain this as rational to myself? How do I get comfortable? And, what's my next step? And then act on it.
I think of stress as wanting things to be different than they are.
I like that.
Like resisting, this is what's happening and I can't accept it. I can't come to terms with it.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, I think a lot about the way I'm running the company and what I'm focused on, what's most meaningful to me and how I get meaning out of the business as being a function of stripping back the specific context of running a software company, being in residential property management, workflow automation. That stuff has meaning to me. It's my bread and butter. I'm committed to deeply understanding it and adding value there. But if I strip that back, what's left? And what's left, I find the most meaning in. The way I'm running my organization is the same way that I would hope and aspire to run a nonprofit, church, school, whatever. And when I focus on that stuff, it gives me a lot more connection to my people. Our mission as a company is to help people become and achieve more than they thought possible. That's the thing that gives me the most meaning and connection. And beyond that, like my leadership, I want to be like open-handed, not gripping, open-hearted, deeply connecting with the people that I'm around. What do you want to be? What are you trying to do running this organization and being with these people that fundamentally transcends the specifics of RBP, property management, et cetera?
Yeah. So one follow-up real quick, and then I'll jump into that. You said something that, the way you position that really made me think of, when something stressful happens, you can look at it and say, this is actually good for me. You know, if you didn't have that, would we accomplish anything? You know,
how you hold it, your perspective.
Yeah, that is what drives people. Mm-hmm. And so I actually think, you know, I think it's something like lean in and own it. It's like, this is good. You know, but no, we got to wrap here. Jumping to your question. So very high level, something like, you know, I passionately believe, I'd almost say like, I think this is objective, but you know, some people might debate it, is technological process or innovation does not happen on its own, right? Like things just don't organize themselves to advance technology. It's actually, you know, I think the opposite, right? And so it takes a lot of effort. And when I say technology, I don't mean, you know, things that may be common with tech, but like look at healthcare, medicine, like any innovation, right? And so, you know, to me, it's, if you look at, you know, the world we live in, everything, you know, that we interact with, you know, and we've been talking about property management a lot. I see so many things. I know, you know, the entrepreneurs who've built these companies, like, I know they've like been beaten up for years. You know, they spend 2 or 3 years building something, spend another 2 or 3 years trying to convince people to use it to maybe get it to work, right? And so, but then, you know, everybody gets to benefit from that. And so to me, it's like, I just have this belief that, you know, if we can build some really cool stuff, get it out to a lot of people, it can make, you know, all the people we work with, you know, impact their lives. You know, how do you develop people? You know, the amount of people that have come into our organization and I've seen move on to do great things. Like, you know, we have people leave our organization. To me, I'm like, you know, I'll celebrate it. You know, if they're going somewhere that's a better opportunity for them, you know, that's exciting, right? So I love the people side, seeing people grow and develop, you know, or if they, you know, we've had many people working this a long time that, you know, I've built some of my best and closest relationships. And just, you know, to me, it's like some of the funnest things I do is some work with our team members, right? It's yeah, there are moments that are funner than snowboarding, right? Like if you're really working a cool problem. So I think it's personally fulfilling. I love the people side. And then I look at the actual products we're building for the industry. And it's like, at the end of the day, we're looking at an industry that, you know, call it, you know, I've seen different data, but, you know, let's say half of the market says, hey, I can do this on my own, right? And I think there's a lot of things, you know, you'll never be able to offer on your own as a you know, provider, but you know, that's the belief. So how do we, you know, transform an industry and say, hey, we've clarified our business model and our value prop to where we can acquire and attract more people, you know? So I think, you know, the impact that we can have to the property manager is fundamentally changing their business model, making it more attractive to other parties. And then I think to the resident, again, like, you know, I imagine in 10, 20 years, you're gonna have this resident experience where like, it just makes sense. Like, yeah, I can go in, I can, you know, select all these different things. I can customize my resident experience. It's really convenient. It's effortless. A lot of those, you know, those friction points are gone. Like we just talked about stress, you know, again, like, you know, you have to layer things up, but you know, we were talking about pest control here. All right. For every single resident, if you're assuming there's a few of these interactions over a lease cycle, it's like, we just remove those 3 stress points, you know. We got a lot more work to do, but, you know, how do we do 100 of those, 200 of those? And you fundamentally, you know, improves people's lives. So, you know, not to ramble there, but like I would say, like those are the different aspects. And like to me, it's like you got to show up and do the work and move things along. And I think it's so easy for people to always have a farming mentality and say like, hey, how do we just, you know, farm and really use what we've built? And with that mentality, I think you'll start to, you know, things don't, you know, progress themselves, right? So like that's what I passionately believe in. You know, part of what gets me up every day is just move things along. So
it's fascinating to me how much permission you've given yourself and your staff to enjoy the process. It's very interesting to me. I see, and I think people just in general see the vibe and like the sense that you guys are having a good time. And I think some people interpret it as like a sales and marketing strategy. I experience it as an extension of your values. And I don't know what it looks like explicitly stated inside the organization, but I see that your belief system says that there can be a deep integration and maybe a inextricable link between enjoying the work and serving the customer. And I feel the same way.
Yeah.
For me, it is the belief that the care for our people and high performance cannot be deconstructed. Maybe somebody can show me how they can. I'm not really interested in that perspective. I choose to link them. And I've seen so much evidence that when you link a deep care for your team and a real focus on objective performance, not one or the other. I find that the ship tips when you pick one. You just pick performance at the expense of the people, put them into a meat grinder, performance suffers. You just focus on care for the people. You kind of make this feel like it's a 501c3 nonprofit. Performance goes right out the window. Yep. When the two are linked, that's where the magic happens. And that has to be an expression of values. So I see you as one of those guys that is expressing your values and you're painting on that canvas. And I think it's cool, man. I'm glad you're doing it. I appreciate having you here.
Thank you. And likewise, no, I obviously love what you guys are doing. And, you know, and I actually think back to like when I first walked in the door, you know, you were one of the people that stood out. And, you know, it's been enjoyable watching, you know, what you've done in the industry with, you know, in multiple different areas too. So yeah, thanks for having me on and excited for the next decade. Next decade. That was the conversation. So, yeah, absolutely. So
here we go. Until next time. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Peace. That's it for this episode. Hope you enjoyed it. You can check out other episodes along the way. If you're watching this on YouTube, appreciate a subscribe. Any comments, I'm always here to engage. If you're listening on an audio platform, would really appreciate a review. It's a great way to help other people find out about the show.